Diefenbaker first ran for office in 1925 and lost. He ran for office 5 more times before he finally won a seat in 1940. He then spent 16 years as a backbencher for the Conservatives, but never failed to run for the leadership of the party when the race was on. He lost in 1942 and 48, but in 1956, the Conservatives, looking for something new, fell in behind this voice of principle and elected him leader of the party on the first ballot. In 1958, Canada signed a defense production sharing agreement with the U.S. As part of the agreement, Canada agreed to buy American-made Warmock missiles to defend Canadian skies. The following year, Prime Minister Diefenbaker cancelled the Avro Aero project, a supersonic military aircraft. About 1,300 workers were laid off, and all completed and partially completed arrows were ordered destroyed. In 1962, the Diefenbaker government devalued the Canadian dollar so that it was worth 92.5 cents compared to the American dollar. This move was intended to increase the sales of the Canadian exports. The Conservative government of John Diefenbaker took steps to protect Canada's economy. First, it introduced tax incentives that benefited Canadian-based industries but excluded American branch plants. Diefenbaker also showed economic independence from the U.S. by developing trade with Cuba and the Soviet Union, two American Cold War enemies. Diefenbaker's successor, Liberal Prime Minister Lester Pearson, tried to take his economic nationalism further. Pearson was not a flamboyant leader like Diefenbaker. His skills lay in diplomacy. The crisis was caused when Prince Nasser of Egypt seized control of the Suez Canal from a British-French company. The canal is a narrow artificial waterway that joins the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Within months, Britain and France joined Israel in attacking Egypt to regain control of the canal. When the Soviet Union declared its support for Egypt, the world once again faced the possibility of war. Pearson recommended a solution to the problem. He suggested forming a United Nations emergency force that would take up positions between the combatants, keeping them apart while a settlement was worked out. For his role in the crisis, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. Pearson announced that he was retiring from politics on December 14, 1967. Pearson's successor was Pierre Trudeau. When Pearson resigned as Prime Minister in 1968, Trudeau signed on as a candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party. At the beginning of the leadership contest, he was no shoo-in, but his personality and style suited the times that were changing. And by the spring of 1968, a wave of Trudeau-mania swept Canada, and Trudeau became a star. He hit all the demographic buttons, old and young, male and female, French and English, East and West. During the October crisis in 1970, the Front de Libération de Québec, FLQ, kidnapped British Trade Consul James Cross at his residence on the 5th of October. 5 days later, Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte was also kidnapped and was later murdered on October 17. Trudeau responded by invoking the War Measures Act, which gave the government sweeping powers of arrest and detention without trial. Although this response is still controversial and was opposed as excessive by figures like Tommy Douglas, it was met with only limited objection from the public. During his 16 years as Prime Minister, he championed seminal changes in the Canadian political landscape. Among them, the Official Language Act in 1969, Implementations of War Measures Act 1970, Wage and Price Controls 1975, appointed Jean Sauve as the first woman Speaker of House of Commons 1980, Canadian Charter of Rights 1982. In the election of 1979, Trudeau's Liberal government was defeated by the Progressive Conservatives, led by Joe Clark, who formed a minority government. On June 4, 1979, the day before his 40th birthday, Clark was sworn in as Canada's youngest Prime Minister after defeating the Liberal Party in the May 1979 general election. Clark was the first Progressive Conservative to head Canada's federal government since the defeat of John Diefenbaker's Progressive Conservative government in the 1963 election. Clark was unable to accomplish much in office because of the tenuous situation of his minority government. During the 1979 election campaign, Clark had promised to cut taxes to stimulate the economy. However, once in office, he adopted a budget designed to curb inflation by slowing economic activity and also proposed an 18% per imperial gallon tax on gasoline in order to reduce the budgetary deficit. Finance Minister John Crosbie touted the budget as short-term pain for long-term gain. Though Clark had hoped this change in policy would work to his advantage, it actually earned him a widespread animosity as a politician who could not keep his promises, even in such a short period. When a new election was called, Clark expected his party to be able to defeat the demoralized and leaderless Liberals easily, since Trudeau had announced his intention to step aside. However, the Progressive Conservatives had misjudged the electorate, since they had not commissioned any polls since August. Clark's Tories campaigned under the slogan, "Real change deserves a fair chance," but the broken promises were still fresh in voters' minds. Trudeau was brought back to power. Two very significant events for Canada occurred during Pierre Trudeau's final term in office. The first was the defeat of the referendum of Quebec sovereignty, called by the Parti Québécois, government of René Lévesque. In the debates between Trudeau and Lévesque, Canadians were treated to a contest between two highly intelligent, articulate, and bilingual politicians who, despite being bitterly opposed, were each committed to the democratic process. Trudeau promised a new constitutional agreement with Quebec should it decide to stay in Canada, and the no side ended up receiving around 60% of the vote. Trudeau had attempted patriation on the Constitution earlier in his career with the Victoria Charter, but ran into a combined force of provincial premiers on the issue of an amending formula. After he threatened to go to London alone, a Supreme Court with the premiers one more time. Further officials in the United Kingdom indicated that the British Parliament was no longer The British Parliament was under no obligation to fulfill any request for legal changes made by Trudeau, particularly if Canadian Convention was not being followed. Trudeau reached an agreement with nine of the premiers, with the notable exception of Lévesque. Quebec's refusal to agree to the new constitution became a source of continued acrimony between the federal and Quebec governments. Even so, the patriation was achieved. The Constitution Act 1982 was proclaimed by Queen Elizabeth on April 17. Even so, the patriation was achieved. The Constitution Act 1982 was proclaimed by Queen Elizabeth on April 17, 1982. One more time. Further officials in the United Kingdom indicated that the British Parliament Trudeau reached an agreement with nine of the premiers, with the notable exception of Lévesque. Quebec's refusal to agree to the new constitution became a source of Even so, the patriation was achieved. The Constitution Act 1982 was proclaimed by Queen Elizabeth on April 17, 1982. Of continued acrimony between the federal and Quebec governments. Fluently bilingual and outgoing, Mulroney was a Montreal lawyer who specialized in labor negotiation for large companies. As leader of the Conservatives, Mulroney called for reorganization of minority French language rights, closer Canadian-American, and better federal-provincial relations. Mulroney and the Conservatives won the 1984 election with 211 out of 282 seats. Mulroney was attracted to Reagan-style economics. He soon called for a strengthened private sector and cut back on the government spending. Mulroney and the Conservatives won another majority government in 1988, the first Conservative government to win 2 consecutive elections since 1962. Soon after his victory, his government signed the free trade agreement with the U.S. Mulroney believed that the free trade would benefit Canadian businesses by increasing investment. By 1993, Mulroney was extremely unpopular with the Canadian electorate. By the time he left office, government spending was increasing again. In February 1993, Mulroney announced his intention to retire. In 1993, Brian Mulroney resigned as the leader of the Conservatives. Kim Campbell won the leadership race that followed. On 25th of June 1993, she became the first female Prime Minister in the history of Canada. Campbell called an election in October 1993 and suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Liberal Party. The Progressive Conservative Party was virtually wiped out of federal politics, winning only 2 seats. Campbell herself was defeated. In 1993, John Curtis replaced Campbell as Progressive Conservative leader. In 1998, he moved to provincial politics as Quebec's Liberal leader. Joe Clark was chosen Conservative leader again. Jean Chrétien won the Liberal leadership race after John Turner resigned as leader of the Liberal Party in 1990. Chrétien had been elected to the House of Commons in the 1960s and was a Trudeau ally. He had served in a number of cabinet positions as Minister of National Revenue, Indian Affairs and Northern Development, Finance and Justice. In 1984, he was the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of External Affairs. In 1986, he retired but returned to win his party's leadership in 1990. In 1993, he led his party to a stunning victory over the Progressive Conservatives, led by Kim Campbell, who had taken over from Mulroney. The Liberals swept Ontario and the Maritimes and won seats in every province, gaining 177 seats, a comfortable majority. Chrétien faced very different problems than Trudeau or Turner. Chrétien faced two new regionally based national parties as his opposition in the House of Commons, the Reform Party and the Bloc Québécois. Chrétien had to face the constitutional issue of Quebec's sovereignty. Yet Canadians in the 1980s and the 1990s seemed to care more about unemployment and economy than about saving Confederation. Yet, like almost all Canadian politicians, Chrétien moved to cut government spending. His government reduced the yearly deficit from $42 million in 1994 to $28.6 million in 1996. Following re-elections in 1997, Chrétien and his finance minister, Paul Martin, continued cutting costs. By 1998, the government declared a surplus of $3.5 million, the first surplus in 28 years.